It was a warm afternoon in Oakwood Heights, the kind of day where the sun danced through the trees and kids' laughter filled the air. In a quiet corner of the neighborhood, a small family was gathered outside a modest brick home. Grandma Lucille was sitting on the porch, her silver hair shining in the sunlight, as her two young grandchildren, Marcus and Bella, raced around the yard playing tag. Lucille had always been a pillar of strength in her family, a woman who carried wisdom in her eyes and kindness in her heart. But today, an unshakable tension lingered in the air. Across the street, a patrol car slowed to a crawl. Inside were officers Miller and Bradley, two men whose presence often brought unease rather than safety to this community. Their stern faces and sharp glances scanned the neighborhood, searching for what no one ever knew. Miller, the senior officer, gripped the steering wheel tightly. "Let's check that house," he muttered, nodding toward Lucille's porch. Bradley hesitated for a moment. "That's just an old lady and some kids," he said, but Miller had already pulled the car to a stop. Lucille noticed them immediately. She'd seen those same officers pass by before, sometimes staring, sometimes smirking. She felt a familiar pang in her chest, an ache born from years of witnessing moments like this. She didn't want to alarm Marcus and Bella, who were still laughing and running in circles, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was about to happen. As the officers stepped out of their car, their heavy boots echoed on the pavement. "Afternoon," Miller said, his voice laced with a sharp edge that didn't match the pleasantry of his words. Lucille stood, her posture calm but firm. "Good afternoon, officers. Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, her voice steady. Bradley avoided eye contact, but Miller stared directly at her. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" he said. Lucille tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Suspicious activity? This is my home, and those are my grandchildren. What could possibly look suspicious about that?" she replied. Miller's tone grew harsher. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. Are you going to cooperate or not?" The children had stopped playing now, sensing the tension. Marcus grabbed his sister's hand and whispered, "What's happening, Grandma?" Lucille turned to them with a reassuring smile. "It's okay, babies. Stay right here." But inside, her heart was racing. She had seen enough injustice in her lifetime to know where this might be heading. What happened next unfolded so quickly that the neighbors who watched from behind their curtains could barely process it. Miller demanded identification, his voice growing louder with every word. When Lucille calmly asked why she was being questioned, he snapped, "Enough of this," and moved to place her in handcuffs. The sight of their grandmother being restrained made Marcus and Bella cry out, their small voices breaking the stillness of the afternoon. "No, leave her alone," Bella yelled, tears streaming down her face. Lucille, though, remained eerily calm, even as the cold metal cuffs locked around her wrists. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she said softly, her eyes locking onto Miller's. For the first time, his confidence wavered. There was something in her gaze, something unshakable, powerful, and unexplainable. As Lucille was led toward the squad car, the wind seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, and the trees, which had been swaying gently moments ago, now stood eerily still. A dog barked in the distance and then went silent, as if even nature itself was holding its breath. "Grandma!" Marcus screamed, running toward her, only to be held back by a neighbor who had come outside to intervene. "It's going to be okay," Lucille called to her grandchildren, but her voice carried more than comfort, it carried a promise. As the car door slammed shut, locking Lucille inside, the officers didn't realize they had just set something in motion, something far beyond their understanding. Lucille wasn't just a grandmother. She carried a legacy, a history, and a power that these men were woefully unprepared to face. And as they drove off, leaving the cries of Marcus and Bella behind, a strange, almost electric charge seemed to ripple through the neighborhood. Lucille closed her eyes and took a deep breath, her hands resting calmly in her lap. "They'll learn soon enough," she whispered. The question was, Would they learn before it was too late? As the squad car rolled away, the streets of Oakwood Heights seemed unnaturally quiet. Neighbors who had peeked through blinds or stood frozen on their porches now exchanged worried glances. Lucille's arrest wasn't just shocking, it felt wrong. She was well known in the community, not just as a loving grandmother, but as someone who had always been there for anyone in need. Whether it was organizing church fundraisers or comforting grieving families, Lucille had a way of making people feel seen and heard. For Marcus and Bella, though, none of that mattered at this moment. Their grandmother, their safe place, was gone. Bella clung to Marcus, her sobs muffled against his shoulder. Marcus, barely holding back his own tears, looked toward their house, hoping for an answer, a solution, anything. A soft voice broke the silence. "Kids, come inside," said Miss Eleanor, the elderly woman from next door. She had been a close friend of Lucille's for years and was one of the first to rush over when she saw the officers approaching. Her weathered hands reached out to guide them toward her porch. "We'll call someone who can help." Inside Miss Eleanor's cozy living room, Marcus sat stiffly on the couch, his fists clenched. Bella was curled up beside him, her face streaked with tears. "Why do they take her?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "Grandma didn't do anything wrong." Miss Eleanor knelt in front of him, her warm, kind eyes meeting his. "I don't know, baby, but your grandma is strong. She'll be okay," she said, though her voice carried a hint of uncertainty. She reached for her phone, dialing Lucille's church pastor, Reverend Harris. Meanwhile, in the squad car, the ride to the station was tense. Lucille sat silently, her expression calm but unreadable. Officer Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, occasionally glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Miller, on the other hand, wore a smug grin. He had no idea who Lucille really was, what she carried within her, but she could feel his arrogance radiating like a bad odor. "You seem awfully quiet for someone in your situation," Miller said, his tone mocking. Lucille didn't respond. Instead, she gazed out the window, watching the familiar streets blur into unfamiliar ones as they left her neighborhood behind. Deep down, she knew that this moment was bigger than her. It always had been. Her mind drifted to her late mother, a woman who had lived through unimaginable hardships, but had passed down more than just stories. She had passed down strength, real strength. Lucille remembered the quiet lessons, the moments when her mother had spoken of a power that ran through their family, a gift meant to protect, to guide, and to heal. Lucille hadn't thought about those stories in years, but now they echoed in her mind with startling clarity. At the station, Lucille was processed like any other suspect. Fingerprints, a mug shot, personal belongings placed into a small plastic bag. The officer's indifference stung, but she remained composed. As they led her to a holding cell, she couldn't help but notice the whispers and sideways glances from some of the younger officers. They seemed uncertain, almost nervous. "Who is she?" one of them murmured to another. "She doesn't look like someone who should be here." But Miller dismissed their concerns with a wave of his hand. "She's just another troublemaker who thinks she's above the law," he said loudly, ensuring Lucille could hear him. She didn't react, but inside, a quiet resolve was building. Back in Oakwood Heights, Reverend Harris had arrived at Miss Eleanor's house. The pastor was a tall, soft-spoken man with a calm demeanor that immediately put the children at ease. He knelt beside Marcus and Bella, his kind eyes filled with concern. "I'm here to help," he said gently. "Your grandma is going to be okay. We just need to figure out what's going on." Eleanor handed him a cup of tea, her hands shaking slightly. "Reverend, this doesn't make sense," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lucille has never been in trouble a day in her life. Why would they target her like this?" Harris nodded, his brow furrowing in thought. "Lucille is a strong woman, but this feels intentional. I'll make some calls and see what I can find out." As the adults strategized, Marcus sat quietly, his young mind racing. He thought about the way his grandmother had looked at the officers, calm but firm, almost like she wasn't afraid of them. He remembered her words. Asterisk, they don't know who they're dealing with. Asterisk, what had she meant by that? Gran was not scared of them, he whispered to Bella, who had fallen into an uneasy sleep beside him. She's got a plan. I just know it. At the station, Lucille sat alone in her cell, her hands resting in her lap. The cold, hard bench was uncomfortable, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were elsewhere. She had seen this coming, not exactly like this. She closed her eyes, taking a deep, steadying breath. Slowly, she began to hum a tune her mother used to sing, a soft, melodic hymn that seemed to fill the empty cell with warmth. The guards outside paused, exchanging confused glances. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. One of the younger officers, a woman named Daniels, approached Miller with a nervous expression. "Sir, I think we should let her make a phone call," she said. Miller scoffed. "She's fine where she is. Let her sit there and think about her choices." Daniels hesitated, but something about Lucille's calm demeanor gnawed at her. "She doesn't seem like a threat," Daniels added. "Maybe we're making a mistake." Miller waved her off. "You're too soft, Daniels. This is exactly why people like her think they can get away with anything." As the hours dragged on, the tension at the station grew thicker. Lucille's quiet resolve began to unsettle the officers. Even Miller, who had been so confident earlier, found himself avoiding her gaze. He tried to convince himself that she was just an ordinary woman, but deep down, a small voice whispered otherwise. Back in the neighborhood, Reverend Harris was on the phone with a lawyer, explaining the situation. The lawyer, a sharp and determined woman named Angela Price, promised to head to the station immediately. "I've dealt with cases like this before," she assured him. "They have no right to hold her without cause." As the pieces began to move, the community rallied. Word of Lucille's arrest spread quickly, and people began gathering at her home, offering support and sharing stories of her kindness. It was as if the entire neighborhood had decided that they wouldn't let this injustice stand. And yet, even as help mobilized, a sense of unease lingered. Marcus, sitting by the window, noticed the way the sky seemed darker than usual, even though it wasn't late. A strange electric feeling hung in the air, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. "Gran was coming back," he said quietly, his voice filled with a conviction that startled even him. "And when she does, they'll be sorry." Somewhere in her cell, Lucille opened her eyes. She didn't know how or when, but she felt it too. The wheels were turning, and the truth would come to light. The evening crept in slowly, the neighborhood blanketed in a quiet unease. At Miss Eleanor's house, the living room buzzed with low conversations. Reverend Harris was on the phone again, pacing back and forth, while Angela Price had joined via video call. Her face was stern, her words quick and precise as she outlined her plan to secure Lucille's release. But every so often, her eyes flicked with concern. "She hasn't been charged, which is good," Angela said firmly. "But we can't underestimate the power of perception. Officers like Miller thrive on intimidation and control. If they can paint her as uncooperative or threatening, it complicates everything." Marcus listened from the corner, clutching his knees to his chest. He didn't fully understand the legal jargon, but he could tell that Angela was someone who got things done. Still, a part of him couldn't shake the image of his grandmother being taken away. It played over and over in his mind, her calm face, her steady words. He looked out the window again, his thoughts tangled with anger and confusion. At the station, Lucille remained seated on the same bench in her cell, her posture unchanging. Her humming had stopped, but the stillness she carried seemed to fill the space. Officer Daniels had walked by her cell more than once, each time feeling a pull she couldn't explain. There was something about this woman that made her uneasy, not in a fearful way, but in a way that demanded respect. Miller, on the other hand, was growing frustrated. The longer Lucille sat there, the more his confidence wavered. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the paperwork in front of him without really seeing it. "Something's not right about this," Bradley said quietly from across the room. Miller shot him a glare. "What's that supposed to mean?" Bradley hesitated, lowering his voice. "I mean, she doesn't seem like the kind of person who would, cause trouble. We didn't find anything on her. No warrants, no record, nothing." Miller slammed his pen onto the desk. "That doesn't mean she's innocent," he snapped. But even as he said it, doubt crept into his voice. Meanwhile, in Oakwood Heights, the small crowd that had gathered outside Lucille's house was growing. Neighbors shared stories of her kindness, their voices filled with indignation and disbelief. One woman, Mrs. Carter, recounted how Lucille had spent hours with her after her husband passed away, offering comfort and practical help. "She's the backbone of this community," Mrs. Carter said firmly. "And they think they can just take her like that. No, we're not standing for this." Among the crowd was a young man named Jamal, who had grown up under Lucille's watchful eye. He was tall and athletic, with a quiet intensity that drew people to him. "We need to let them know we're not backing down," Jamal said, his voice steady but charged. "They think we'll just roll over, but they don't understand who they're dealing with." Back at the station, Angela Price had arrived in person. She strode into the precinct with a confidence that turned heads, her briefcase swinging at her side. She approached the desk, her sharp gaze locking onto the clerk. "I'm here to see Lucille Thompson," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. The clerk hesitated, glancing toward Miller, who was watching from his desk. Angela followed his gaze and marched straight over. "Officer Miller," she began, her tone brisk. "I'm representing Mrs. Thompson. I need to speak with her immediately and would like to review the charges you're holding her on." Miller leaned back in his chair, a smug smile creeping onto his face. "Was still deciding whether to press charges," he said casually. "She's being held for questioning." Angela raised an eyebrow. "Questioning without probable cause or evidence? That's a bold move." Miller's smile faltered. Angela didn't wait for a response. "Take me to her," she demanded. As Angela was led to the holding area, Lucille looked up, her expression softening slightly. "Angela," she said calmly as the lawyer approached. "Lucille," Angela replied, her voice a mix of relief and determination. "I'm here to get you out." Lucille nodded, but there was no urgency in her demeanor. "I knew you'd come," she said simply. Angela sat across from her, lowering her voice. "What happened? They're claiming you were uncooperative, but I know there's more to this." Lucille met her eyes, her own gaze steady. "They came looking for trouble," she said, "and when they didn't find it, they decided to create it." Angela sighed, her frustration evident. "We'll fight this, but I need you to stay strong. People out there are rallying for you. They know this isn't right." Lucille smiled faintly. "It's not just about me, Angela. This is bigger than that. It always has been." Angela tilted her head, sensing there was something Lucille wasn't saying. Before she could press further, the sound of raised voices echoed through the station. Outside, a group of neighbors had arrived, led by Jamal. They stood on the precinct steps, holding signs hastily made from poster boards and markers. "Justice for Lucille," they chanted, their voices ringing through the air. Inside, Miller watched the scene unfold from a window, his frustration mounting. "What do they think they're accomplishing?" he muttered under his breath. Bradley, standing nearby, crossed his arms. "They're standing up for her," he said quietly. "Maybe we should be listening." Miller turned sharply. "Are you questioning me?" Bradley held his ground. "I'm saying we might have jumped the gun on this one. People don't rally like that for someone unless they believe in her." As the tension inside the station grew, Lucille remained composed. She could feel the energy building, not just in the precinct, but in the community. It was as if something was shifting, a collective awakening that couldn't be ignored. Angela leaned closer, her voice low but firm. "We'll get you out, Lucille. But I need to know, do you have any idea why they targeted you?" Lucille hesitated, her eyes flickering with a knowledge she wasn't ready to share. Sometimes, Angela, people don't need a reason. Sometimes they just fear what they don't understand. Angela frowned, sensing there was more beneath the surface. What is it they don't understand? She asked softly. Lucille didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked past Angela, her gaze distant but determined. They'll find out soon enough. The question wasn't if the truth would come to light. It was whether everyone involved would be ready for what it revealed. The chants outside the station grew louder, reverberating off the walls and seeping into every corner of the building. Justice for Lucille. Justice for all. The group, once a handful of neighbors, had swelled into a crowd that filled the precinct steps and spilled onto the sidewalk. Their voices were a mix of anger and hope, a unified demand for fairness in a system that had failed them too many times before. Inside, Officer Miller paced his office, his jaw clenched. Each chant felt like a personal attack, a reminder that his authority wasn't as absolute as he wanted it to be. He glanced at Bradley, who sat silently at his desk, scrolling through his phone. "This is getting out of hand," Miller snapped. "We need to shut this down." Bradley looked up, his expression unreadable. "Shutting it down won't fix anything. You think dragging Lucille in here without cause was going to go unnoticed?" His voice was calm, but carried an edge that Miller didn't like. "I did my job," Miller barked. "If they don't like it, that's their problem." Bradley didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Miller hated the way the younger officer was looking at him, like he was the one being judged. He grabbed his radio, barking orders to the officers outside to disperse the crowd. Meanwhile, in her cell, Lucille remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Angela had been escorted out after their conversation, and the silence that followed had given Lucille time to think. She could feel the energy outside, the strength of her community rallying behind her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, not since the days when her mother had spoken of their family's role as protectors, as catalysts for change. She thought of Marcus and Bella, their young faces filled with fear as the officers took her away. The memory stirred something deep within her, a determination that had been lying dormant. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for them, for their future, for the community that had always been her home. As Lucille sat in quiet reflection, Officer Daniels approached her cell, her expression a mixture of hesitation and curiosity. "Mrs. Thompson," she said softly, gripping the bars. "Can I ask you something?" Lucille looked up, her eyes kind but piercing. "Of course, child." Daniels hesitated, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "How are you so calm? Most people would be yelling, crying, trying to defend themselves. But you're just here, like you already know how this ends." Lucille smiled faintly. Sometimes the loudest statement is made in silence, and sometimes strength comes from knowing that the truth will reveal itself, no matter how hard others try to hide it. Daniels nodded slowly, her own unease growing. "Do you think you'll get out of this?" Lucille's smile widened slightly. "I'm not worried about getting out, dear. I'm worried about what happens when the truth comes to light." Daniels didn't know what to say. She felt a strange pull toward this woman, an unexplainable sense that Lucille knew something no one else did. "I'll check on you later," she said, stepping back. But as she walked away, her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Outside, the atmosphere was reaching a boiling point. Jamal stood at the front of the crowd, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't usually the type to speak up, but tonight was different. "We're not going anywhere until they let her go," he shouted, his voice carrying over the chants. The crowd roared in agreement, their collective energy pushing back against the officers trying to contain them. Miller stormed outside, his face red with frustration. "This is an unlawful gathering," he shouted into his megaphone. "You need to disperse immediately, or we'll start making arrests." The crowd didn't budge. Instead, the chants grew louder, their determination unshaken. Miller's face twisted with anger. He gestured to the officers beside him. "Start moving them back," he ordered. But before they could act, a low rumble filled the air. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make everyone pause. The crowd fell silent, their eyes darting around in confusion. The officers hesitated, their hands hovering over their weapons. The rumble grew louder, deeper, almost like thunder, but the sky was clear. Inside the station, Lucille's eyes flickered open. She felt it, the shift, the awakening. It was as if the very air around her was alive, charged with a force she hadn't felt in years. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate. The rumble vibrated through the walls, shaking the foundation of the building. Miller turned toward the station, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. Bradley stepped outside, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I don't know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it doesn't feel normal." Back in the cell, Lucille closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The energy coursing through her was almost overwhelming, but she welcomed it. This was what her mother had spoken of, the legacy she had passed down. It wasn't just strength, it was connection, a bond with something greater than herself. As the rumble grew, the crowd outside stood frozen, their chants replaced by murmurs of confusion and fear. Jamal looked back toward the station, his heart pounding. He didn't know what was happening, but deep down, he felt that it was tied to Lucille. Gran was doing something, Marcus whispered to Bella, who clung to his arm. He didn't know how he knew, but he was certain. She's gonna make them listen. Inside the station, chaos erupted. Computers flickered on and off, lights buzzed and dimmed, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Officers scrambled to make sense of it, their radios crackling with static. Miller barked orders, but no one seemed to hear him. Lucille stood in her cell, her posture calm but powerful. She wasn't doing anything physically, but her presence seemed to command the space. The energy around her built to a crescendo, and for the first time, the officers truly began to understand that this was no ordinary woman. Miller stormed toward the holding area, his frustration turning to panic. "What the hell is going on here?" he shouted, his voice echoing down the hallway. But as he approached Lucille's cell, he stopped short. Lucille met his gaze, her expression serene but unyielding. "You wanted to know the truth," she said softly. "Now it's coming to you." The rumble peaked, shaking the station to its core. Miller stumbled back, his bravado crumbling. And in that moment, he realized he wasn't in control, not of Lucille, not of the situation, not even of himself. Something far greater was at play, and there was no stopping it now. Miller staggered back, his face pale, sweat glistening on his forehead. He couldn't make sense of what he was seeing or feeling. The air in the precinct was heavy, thick with an energy that defied explanation. It wasn't just the physical tremor, it was something deeper, something intangible but undeniably real. He felt exposed, as if every secret, every dark corner of his soul, was being laid bare. Lucille, still standing in her cell, tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but penetrating. "You've spent so much time controlling others," she said, her voice low but clear. "But control is a fragile thing, Officer Miller. It only takes a moment for it to slip away." Miller opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His confidence, his authority, seemed to dissolve under her steady gaze. He backed away, muttering incoherently, and disappeared down the hall. Outside, the crowd had grown silent, their attention fixed on the station. Jamal stood at the front, his fists clenched, his heart racing. He didn't know what was happening inside, but he could feel the tension, the shift. It was like the air itself was alive, crackling with unseen power. Angela Price emerged from the station, her usually composed demeanor replaced by a mix of confusion and urgency. She approached Jamal and the others, her voice steady but laced with concern. "Something's happening in there," she said. "I don't know what it is, but it's unlike anything I've ever seen." Jamal nodded, his gaze unwavering. "It's Lucille," he said simply. "She's doing something. I don't know how, but she is." Angela frowned. unsure of how to respond. She was a woman of logic and reason, grounded in facts and evidence, but even she couldn't deny the strange energies surrounding the situation. "Whatever it is," she said, "we need to stay focused. They'll be looking for any excuse to turn this on us." Inside, Officer Daniels lingered near Lucille's cell, her unease growing by the second. She had always prided herself on being level-headed, but now she felt anything but. The flickering lights, the strange hum in the air, the way Lucille seemed to command the space without saying a word, it all felt like a puzzle she couldn't piece together. "Mrs. Thompson," Daniels said cautiously, stepping closer to the bars. "What's going on here? What are you doing?" Lucille turned to her, her gaze softening. "I'm not doing anything, dear," she said. "I'm just being." Daniels shook her head, frustrated. "That doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense." Lucille's smile was gentle but knowing. Sometimes the truth isn't about sense, it's about what's right. And what's been hidden for too long is finally finding its way to the surface. Daniels opened her mouth to reply, but was interrupted by a sudden crash from the main office. The sound was sharp and jarring, like glass shattering under pressure. She turned, her hand instinctively reaching for her holster, but before she could move, a voice echoed through the hallway. "Enough." The word was simple, but it carried a weight that seemed to ripple through the entire building. Daniels froze, her heart pounding. She turned back to Lucille, but the older woman hadn't moved. The voice hadn't been hers. In the main office, Bradley and Miller stood frozen, their eyes darting around the room. The computers had gone dark, their screens filled with static. Papers fluttered to the floor, caught in an inexplicable gust of wind, and then from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall and imposing, with a presence that seemed to fill the room. He wore a long coat, his face partially obscured by the dim light, but his voice was clear, steady, and commanding. "You've crossed a line," he said, his gaze fixed on Miller. "And now, it's time to face." Miller stumbled back, his bravado completely shattered. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "Someone who's been watching," he said. "Someone who knows the truth about what you've done." Bradley took a step forward, his expression cautious. "What truth? What are you talking about?" The man turned to him, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "The truth about this precinct, about the corruption, the lies, the abuse of power. It's all coming to light now, whether you're ready for it or not." Miller's face twisted with rage, his fear fueling his desperation. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat. "You have no proof." The man smiled faintly, a cold, knowing smile. "Don't I?" he said. "The files, the footage, the testimonies, they're all out there. And it's not just me who knows. Your time is running out." Back in her cell, Lucille closed her eyes, a wave of relief washing over her. She didn't know the man personally, but she recognized his purpose. He was part of the shift, part of the reckoning that had been building for years, and now it was finally here. Outside, the crowd stirred as the tension reached its peak. Jamal glanced at Angela, his voice low but determined. "Something's about to happen," he said, "and when it does, we need to be ready." Angela nodded, her resolve hardening. Whatever was coming, she knew they had to stand together. The stakes had never been higher, and the fight for justice was far from over. The air in the precinct felt electric, a storm of tension ready to break. Miller, his face pale and lined with fear, took a shaky step back from the imposing figure before him. The man in the coat stood firm, his presence commanding the room. He reached into his pocket, and for a moment, everyone froze. Miller's hand instinctively went to his holster, but the man only pulled out a small flash drive, holding it up for all to see. "This," the man said, his voice steady and unyielding, "is everything. Records of every fabricated report, every incident of abuse, every time this precinct looked the other way when injustice was done. It's all here." Miller's composure crumbled further, his breathing shallow. "You're bluffing," he hissed. "There's no way you could have all that." The man's gaze didn't waver. "You'd be surprised what people will share when they're tired of being silenced," he said, "and your time of silencing others is over." From her cell, Lucille listened intently. She felt the shift, the moment when the truth began to take form, tangible and undeniable. She closed her eyes, a small smile tugging at her lips. This was what her mother had always spoken of, the moment when power bent toward justice, no matter how long it took. Officer Daniels, who had been standing near Lucille's cell, watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. She stepped closer to the man, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" she asked. "Why are you here?" The man turned to her, his expression softening just slightly. "I'm here because it's time for change," he said, "and because people like Mrs. Thompson deserve better than this." Daniels looked at Lucille, who met her gaze with quiet understanding. In that moment, something shifted in Daniels too. The doubts, the guilt, the questions she'd buried for years, they all rose to the surface. She turned back to the man. "What do you need me to do?" He smiled faintly, nodding in approval. "Help me make sure this sees the light of day," he said, holding up the flash drive. The sound of shouting erupted from outside as the crowd surged forward, emboldened by the growing tension. Jamal led the charge, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Let her out," he yelled. "We're not leaving until you release her." Miller stormed to the front of the precinct, his face red with fury. "Disperse the crowd." He barked at the officers, but many hesitated, their loyalty faltering in the face of what was unfolding. In that moment, the rumbling that had shaken the building earlier returned, but this time it wasn't just a sound. The lights flickered violently, and a sudden gust of wind seemed to whip through the station. The glass doors at the entrance shattered, sending shards flying in all directions. The crowd outside fell silent, stunned by the explosion of energy. Lucille stood in her cell, her posture tall and unwavering. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the bars. A faint hum seemed to emanate from her, an unspoken force that pulsed through the room. The cell door creaked, then swung open with a groan. She stepped out, her movements deliberate, her expression calm. Miller turned, his eyes widening as he saw her. How did you?" he stammered, but he couldn't finish the sentence. He took a step back, his fear palpable. Lucille walked toward him, her presence radiating power and resolve. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. "The walls you've built, the lies you've told, they can't hold forever," she said. "You've underestimated the strength of truth, and now it's here." The man in the coat stepped beside her, holding the flash drive up again. "This is going live," he said. "Right now." He pulled out his phone, connecting the drive and tapping a few buttons. Within seconds, the files began uploading to a secure platform, set to release across multiple channels. Miller lunged forward, desperate to stop him, but Jamal burst through the doors with the crowd behind him, blocking his path. "You're done," Jamal said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on Miller. "It's over." As the files uploaded, a notification lit up on every phone in the precinct. The officers pulled out their devices, their faces turning ashen as they scrolled through the evidence. Corruption, brutality, cover-ups. It was undeniable, and it was everywhere. Miller dropped to his knees, his hands trembling. "No," he whispered, "this can't be happening." Lucille stepped closer to him, her voice soft but firm. "This is what happens when you forget that power belongs to the people, not to you." The room was silent, save for the hum of phones and the murmurs of the officers. Daniels stepped forward, her voice shaking but resolute. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, "what happens now?" Lucille turned to her, her expression gentle. "Now we rebuild," she said. "Not just this precinct, but the trust and the hope that you all have broken. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it." As she spoke, a sudden commotion at the back of the crowd caught everyone's attention. A young boy pushed through, Marcus, his face lit with determination. Bella followed close behind, clutching his hand. "Grandma," he shouted, running to her. Lucille knelt down, her arms outstretched. She held them tightly, her heart full. "It's going to be all right," she whispered. "We're going to make it right." The man in the coat watched silently, his work complete. He turned to leave, but Jamal called out to him. "Wait, who are you?" The man paused, glancing back. "Someone who believes in the power of change," he said, and then he was gone, disappearing into the night. The precinct stood in silence, the weight of what had just unfolded sinking in. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the streets. Inside, Lucille held her grandchildren close, her resolve unshaken. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. The truth was out, and there was no going back. As the cheers from outside faded into the night, the precinct felt strangely still. Lucille stood with her grandchildren by her side, their small hands holding onto her tightly. The weight of what had just happened was sinking in, but so was the relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, the truth had been set free. Lucille looked down at Marcus and Bella, brushing a hand over their heads. "You see," she said softly, "sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight without lifting a finger." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes wide and full of questions. "But, Grandma, how did you do that? How did you open the door?" Lucille smiled, her expression both tender and knowing. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was all of us. Every person who stood up, every voice that refused to be silenced. That's where the real power is, baby." Bella leaned against her, her small voice breaking through the silence. "Are they going to be okay now?" Lucille hugged her tightly, her heart aching with the simplicity of her question. "They have a lot of work to do," she said, glancing at the officers still standing in stunned silence. "But sometimes, realizing you're wrong is the first step toward making things right." Officer Daniels approached hesitantly, her face a mixture of regret and determination. She had been a part of the system for so long that she wasn't sure where to start, but Lucille's quiet strength gave her hope. "Mrs. Thompson," she began, "I don't know how to fix everything, but I want to try. Will you help me?" Lucille regarded her for a long moment, then nodded. "It's not about me helping you," she said. "It's about all of us working together. If you're ready to listen, really listen, then you've already taken the first step." Daniels nodded, her resolve solidifying. She turned to the other officers, her voice rising. "We can't undo what's been done, but we can decide what kind of precinct this will be moving forward. No more lies. No more covering for each other. We have to be better than this." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shame to cautious agreement. Some nodded. Others remained silent, but the message was clear. Change was coming, whether they were ready or not. Outside, the crowd had begun to disperse, their spirits lifted by the victory. Jamal stood near the entrance, watching as people hugged, laughed, and wiped away tears. Angela joined him, her usual sharp demeanor softened by the events of the night. "This is just the beginning," she said, crossing her arms. "There's still a long road ahead." Jamal nodded, his eyes on Lucille as she stepped outside with her grandchildren. "I know," he said, "but tonight we proved something. That we're stronger together, that we can hold them accountable." Lucilla walked up to them, a tired but genuine smile on her face. "You two did good," she said. "All of you. It's not easy standing up like that." Angela raised an eyebrow. "You're the one who stood the tallest, Mrs. Thompson," she said. "I don't know how you kept your composure in there." Lucille chuckled, a deep, warm sound that seemed to ease the tension around them. "When you've seen as much as I have, you learn not to waste your energy on fear," she said. "Besides, I wasn't alone. Not for a second." Jamal looked at her, his brow furrowed. "That man," he said. "The one who came in with the files. Do you know who he was?" Lucille shook her head, her expression thoughtful. "No, I don't," she admitted. "But it doesn't matter. People like him, like you, they're all part of the same thing. A force bigger than any one of us." As the group stood together, The night sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. It was a new day, and with it came the promise of change. The precinct was no longer just a building. It was a symbol of what could be transformed when people refused to give up. Back at her home, Lucille sat in her kitchen with Marcus and Bella, a cup of tea steaming in her hands. The events of the night felt like a distant storm, but the lessons remained sharp in her mind. She looked at her grandchildren, their faces full of hope and curiosity, and felt a deep sense of purpose. "You too," she said, her voice firm but loving, "are going to grow up in a world that's different because of nights like this, but you have to promise me something." Marcus sat up straight, his face serious. "What is it, Grandma?" "You have to keep fighting for what's right," she said, "even when it's hard, even when it feels like no one's listening. Because every voice matters, every action counts." Bella nodded solemnly, her small hand reaching out to touch Lucille's. "We promise, Grandma." Lucille smiled, her heart swelling with pride. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew this. The fight for justice was ongoing, and it was in good hands. Across town, the man in the coat walked down a quiet street, his pace unhurried. He glanced at his phone, seeing the ripple effects of the files he had uploaded. News outlets were picking up the story, activists were sharing it far and wide, and the conversation was growing louder by the minute. He slipped the phone into his pocket, a faint smile on his lips. His work here was done, but the work of others had just begun. In the weeks that followed, the precinct underwent a thorough investigation. Officers who had participated in or covered up wrongdoing were held accountable, while those committed to change took on the task of rebuilding trust with the community. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was a start. Lucille continued to be a quiet force in her neighborhood, attending meetings, mentoring young activists, and sharing her wisdom with anyone willing to listen. She knew that real change didn't happen overnight, but she also knew that every small step mattered. And so, life moved forward. The scars of the past remained, but they served as reminders of what had been overcome and what still needed to be done. Lucille's story became a symbol of resilience, her name spoken with reverence by those who sought to make the world a better place. As the sun set on another day, Lucille sat on her porch, watching Marcus and Bella play in the yard. She sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her. The world wasn't perfect, but it was changing, and for that she was grateful.